after a very long time, the Spirit apparently had only wanted to say, put on as much molasses as he likes. So usually, the spirits responded to yes or no questions after that. And it seems to be that the spirits seemed to share the belief systems of whoever was speaking to them, which was very convenient. As they experimented with the spirits, Amy and Isaac continued their abolitionist work. Tired of pressure under abolitionist friends to desist in their political activity with non-Quaker allies, the Posts joined the Congregational Friends in Waterloo, right next door to Seneca Falls, made primarily of radical abolitionist ex-Quakers. This group was organized in June of 1848. Lucretia Mott, visiting her sister Martha Coffin Wright, assisted the founders with their organization, which from early on was marked by her radicalism, as well as by the Post's claim of spirit communication. After some skepticism, the group soon agreed that the Rochester rappings proved that the bonds between souls were unbroken and that departed friends could still speak their truths from beyond death. They were a small group. They needed to find allies wherever they could. The Congregational Friends claimed every person is created in the image of God and is a limited transcript of the perfect architect, and that an unbroken chain exists between the infinite and all beings. They followed Quaker founder George Fox's call to mind the light. This, trust in the power of the divine to work within each individual soul, was for them the beginning and end of all religion. Now, after helping the Congregational Friends form this community, Lucretia Mott stayed in town to catch up with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who she first met in London at the World Anti-Slavery Convention. Elizabeth had been the young bride of abolitionist Henry Stanton, and Lucretia was a delegate. The 1840 convention left both women embittered about women's place in the anti-slavery movement. Though Lucretia Mott had national respect among abolitionists in the United States, she was not allowed to speak at the convention. In fact, the abolitionists in London spent the first days of the meeting discussing not abolition, but whether or not women had the right to speak on the floor, because God disagreed with that. Mott and Stanton were not alone in their outrage. Mrs. Stanton recalled a disgusted George Bradburn raged at his fellow abolitionists. She said that he declared with tremendous emphasis that if they could prove to him that the Bible taught the entire subjection of one half of the race to the other, he should consider that the best thing he could do for humanity would be to bring together every Bible in the universe and make a great bonfire of it. Mrs. Stanton and Mrs. Mott always planned to act. 1848 seemed like the perfect time. Elizabeth was certainly tired of what she was doing. So on July 13th, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott joined several local Quakers, spiritualists, at Richard and Jane Hunt's house in Waterloo. There, Elizabeth Cady Stanton told them of her growing discontent with woman's lot, and they decided there to call a women's rights convention. They wrote up a call that evening and had it published in the Seneca County Courier the next day, giving only 5 days' notice to potential participants. As they sent out calls for the Women's Rights Convention, the community was abuzz with rumors of ghosts and angels. Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments on a spirit table in the parlor of progressive Quakers Tom and Anne McClintock, who would later become spiritualists. And raps were heard in the Stanton home as well, although I wonder, with her many children, if there were other less spectral explanations for this phenomenon. July 19th and 20th, 1848, the convention was held at the Wesleyan Methodist Church on Fall Street, my uncle and aunt's church. Their son Edwin's future wife, Mary Bascom Bolt, was 13 at the time. She attended the convention with her father, Ansel Bascom, the mayor of Seneca Falls, and a friend of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Mary later wrote, "The whole scene comes before me as vividly as if yesterday. The old chapel with its dusty windows, the gallery on 3 sides, the wooden benches or pews, and the platform with the desk and the communion table, and the group gathered there. Mrs. Stanton, stout, short, with her merry eye and expression of good humor. Lucretia Mott, whose presence then as now commanded respect wherever she might be. Mary Ann McClintock, a dignified Quaker matron with 4 daughters around her, 2 of whom took active part in the proceedings. Attendees at the Seneca Falls Convention and the Rochester Convention that followed it 2 weeks later included Amy Post, Lucy Coleman, Rhoda DeGarmo, Mary Ann and Thomas McClintock, Sarah Fish, Catherine Fish Stebbins, Sarah Hollowell, and Sarah Anthony Burtis, Susan B. Anthony's cousin. All of them were connected to the posts. All were Congregationalist friends who would become spiritualists. Of those who had originally witnessed the Fox sisters at the post home in Rochester, only Abigail Bush was a non-Quaker. She would also become a spiritualist, as well as the chairperson of the Rochester Convention. While the newspapers were digesting the Seneca Falls and Rochester conventions, spiritualism was gaining momentum. About a year after the Fox sisters visited the Post family, impressing them with their ability to contact their deceased loved ones, the spirits advised Isaac to rent Corinthian Hall in Rochester to spread the messages of the spirits beyond their social circle. The hall was rented, and for 3 nights, in November of 1849, audiences were astonished by spirit rappings. By the late 1850s, spiritualism was accepted by most Quaker splinter groups, but had grown well beyond the dissident Quakers who first imparted religious significance to the ghostly rappings. Even those reformers who did not believe realized the influence of spiritualism's popular appeal. One could not go far without meeting a spiritualist or participating in a conversation on the topic. In 1854, the Congregational Friends of Waterloo changed their names to the Waterloo Friends of Human Progress. Susan B. Anthony, a Rochester Quaker, was their clerk. The topic of spiritualism was a repeated theme in the young woman's social discourse. On a trip to the Mott home, she engaged in a conversation of spiritualism with a group of longtime Reform associates. She reported that Ernestine Rose thought the entire thing a humbug. Sarah Grimke was all enthusiasm in the faith, and Eliab Capron didn't believe. He knows there is a reality in spirit disembodied, communicating with the living. As for Miss Anthony and Mott's, they were not sure. Women such as Frances Wright, Abby Kelly, Lucy Stone, and Antoinette Brown were pioneers of women's public speaking, who advocated radical reform from public platforms. To do so, they frequently faced deep social disapproval. Throughout the antebellum period, the number of female reform lecturers increased dramatically as the nation grew accustomed to hearing women speak in public. This increasing comfort level, America felt with the image of women defying the Pauline doctrine, was due in part to spiritualists, who under the influence of spirits delivered well-crafted and rousing speeches in trance. Female spiritualist speakers found that men who would never listen to a woman pay close attention to ghosts. While other women struggled to find venues and the courage to speak of women's rights in a public arena, spiritualists accomplished this in fairly large numbers, often addressing hundreds of people who listened in rapt attention. Trance speakers were not mere table tippers. They saw themselves as channels of not a particular named spirit, as in a seance, but rather of a more generalized higher consciousness, a consciousness that usually seemed to advocate women's rights. Speaking under this influence, they could set aside the trepidation that so plagued other women speakers, whose voices faltered or grew too quiet to hear. Spiritualist women's voices rang out clearly and confidently within the trance state. Additionally, as Susan B. Anthony lamented